Question period. I recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, Saskatchewan people are struggling with the cost of living. While the cost of everything keeps going up, groceries, tuition, rent, mortgage payments, fuel, and 57% of Saskatchewan people are struggling to pay the grocery bill, this Premier has offered zero relief. Mr. Speaker, how much worse does it have to get before the Premier cuts the gas tax and gives Saskatchewan families a break?
Recognize the Premier.
Mr. Speaker. As I've said on the floor of this Assembly many times, there's over $2 billion each and every year in each and every budget, including this most recent budget, Mr. Speaker, that are deemed affordability measures for Saskatchewan families, resulting in Saskatchewan being one of the most affordable places to live in the nation of Canada. Mr. Speaker, to the Leader of the Opposition's question about, what is going to challenge us on the affordability measures into the future, Mr. Speaker, primary among that is the federally imposed carbon tax. It's increasing year after year after year, which makes me wonder, Mr. Speaker, why that leader and members of that caucus answered the call to arms to attend the Trudeau campaign school, Mr. Speaker, to keep that individual in place that is going to continue to increase the affordability challenges that Saskatchewan and Canadian families are facing today far into the future.
Recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Increasingly desperate to deflect, Mr. Speaker. Now, we've talked a lot in the last 2 weeks about the private surgery company that donated to the Sask Party, that received a $6 million contract, and that had former Finance Minister Kevin Doherty as their lobbyist. But this surgery deal, Mr. Speaker, isn't the only deal that raises questions under this tired and out-of-touch government, nor is it the only one with Kevin Doherty as the lobbyist. CRM Tire Processing of Newport Beach, California, got the contract for tire recycling in Saskatchewan, and the Saskatoon business that had been doing that work lost it. And guess who was their lobbyist, Mr. Speaker? Mr. Doherty. Did the Premier meet with Mr. Doherty on this tire recycling deal?
Recognize the Premier.
No.
Recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Appreciate the short answer, Mr. Speaker. Now, Mr. Speaker, handing this contract to an American company when a Saskatchewan company was already doing the work, well, Mr. Speaker, it raises a lot of eyebrows. Even more so when we look at the lobbyist registry and see again Kevin Doherty registered to lobby for this American company that got this lucrative contract. Now, yesterday, the Premier said that he never met with Kevin Doherty on the surgical backlog. He's already answered that he did not meet with Kevin Doherty on this particular contract or this deal, Mr. Speaker. But does he have any concerns with the deal as we've outlined, Mr. Speaker?
Recognize the Premier.
My understanding is the contract, both of them are RFP'd, Mr. Speaker, by the organization that puts those contracts out. I'm not sure if at the Trudeau campaign school, the Leader of the Opposition is suggesting that we should be sole sourcing those contracts, Mr. Speaker, because that's simply not the case in this particular case, Mr. Speaker. There was an RFP, and it's my understanding that the company she's referring to didn't bid on it.
Here. Right.
Recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, the Premier is dismissive of the concerns, but you'll remember that Saskatchewan's business community was highly critical of this deal with an American company that had a former finance minister as their lobbyist. The Saskatoon Chamber of Commerce, Mr. Speaker, said at the time, and I quote, "Our concern is the apparent unwarranted regulation of a once free market that is now siphoning jobs and market opportunities away from our cities and reassigning them to business interests outside of our borders." I end the quote. Mr. Speaker, did CRM Tire get the contract because they had the best pitch or because they had the best lobbyist?
Recognize the Premier.
I think they got the contract because they were the only bidder in an RFP, Mr. Speaker.
Ding, ding, ding. Recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, this Premier clearly has a leadership problem. Whether it's this tired and out-of-touch government signing deals with companies who just happen to have a former finance minister as their lobbyist, or this Premier's failure to keep that education minister in his post. Now, Mr. Speaker, yesterday when he was asked by reporters, the Premier wouldn't say who he believes. Is it the grieving mother who said there was no apology in that private meeting, or the education minister, Mr. Speaker, who said that there was? Mr. Speaker, the fact that that minister is still in his post says volumes about that Premier's leadership. That's right. My question, why won't he fire that education minister?
Recognize the Premier.
As I said yesterday, this education minister, due to the effort and the work and the listening ear that he is bringing to this file, whether it be to all of the partner school divisions, the Saskatchewan Teachers Federation, the school community councils, parents, teachers in the classrooms that he's visited, Mr. Speaker, is reason that he has confidence of not only myself but the entirety of cabinet and caucus, Mr. Speaker. With respect, Mr. Speaker, with respect, what I would say, and maybe the leader of the opposition has, found these newfound questions at the Trudeau campaign school that she attended this past week, Mr. Speaker. But I would say, Mr. Speaker, that when people come down, we'll listen here, Mr. Speaker. When people come down to this assembly with fair questions of their government, it's government members on this side and ministers that meet with those individuals, which is a far sight more than can be said about the NDP when they were in government, because they didn't meet with anybody with fair questions that came down here.
Recognize the member from Saskatoon Eastview.
Mr. Speaker, the question was about a grieving mother who came here 3 days to raise an alarm about that minister's failures. What a shameful answer from that Premier. Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Education, this one, is by far the worst education minister that we've seen yet from this Sask Party government. He has a history of saying things that are demonstrably inconsistent with the facts. And he's sown chaos in the education sector since day one in that post. We need to move forward from the damage that minister has done to our classrooms. Why won't that minister realize that he's the problem and resign today?
Hear, hear. Recognize the Premier.
I can tell you very quickly that any resignation wouldn't be accepted, Mr. Speaker, because of the work and the effort that this education minister is bringing on behalf of parents across this province, Mr. Speaker. Not only with the effort and engagement, Mr. Speaker, but the listening ear to enact policies that are being asked for by Saskatchewan parents, like the policy for parental rights, to ensure that parents can be involved in their child's education, their child's classroom, Mr. Speaker, and open up that communication with what is happening in our schools, in our children's schools across the province, Mr. Speaker. With respect to the member opposite, Mr. Speaker, it isn't that long ago when people came to this assembly with fair questions of their government and the ministers, and it was the NDP government that would not even take 5 minutes to meet with them. Thankfully, in 2007, Mr. Speaker, a number of things changed. One is the investment in our education sector. Two is there's a government here that will listen to Saskatchewan people and will meet with them when they travel to their capital city.
Recognize the member from Saskatoon Eastview.
Mr. Speaker, let's go over this minister's greatest hits, or maybe they're his biggest blunders. In his first day on the job, he told reporters that every member of the government caucus had heard concerns about pronouns in school. But 5 minutes later, the Minister of Health proved that brand new education minister to be dead wrong. Later on, the minister waged a billboard campaign against Saskatchewan teachers. And for the last 4 months, he has presided over the longest teacher job action in Saskatchewan history. That minister is bad at his job. He should resign. Why won't he do that today?
Hear, hear. Recognize the Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, when the NDP resort to personal attacks, it's because they don't want to talk about their 16 years in government, Mr. Speaker. They don't want to talk about the 176 schools closed. They don't want to want to talk about the 400 teachers closed, Mr. Speaker. And the most shameful part is that they told Saskatchewan students the best hope for their future was in Calgary, Mr. Speaker. Not under this government, Mr. Speaker. We have grown this economy. The best hope for Saskatchewan students is right here at home, Mr. Speaker. We're building schools. We're hiring EAs. We're hiring teachers, Mr. Speaker. And we have legislation that preserves parents' ability to be involved in their children's life, Mr. Speaker. That's this government's record on education, and one that we're proud of.
Recognize the member from Regina Welsh Acres.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, this government is failing on education, and they're failing when it comes to delivering health care to Saskatchewan people that they can count on. This is especially true for rural Saskatchewan. So they want to talk about their record? Let's talk about their record. We know that between August of 2019 and July of 2023, that there were over 950 closures to rural emergency rooms, hospital labs, obstetrical care, and other life-saving services. 950 closures that impacted 53 different hospitals in rural Saskatchewan under this government's watch. They seem uncomfortable to be talking about their own record, Mr. Speaker. I don't understand. Will the minister today tell this assembly how many communities have healthcare closures today?
Hear, hear. Recognize the Minister of Rural and Remote Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for the question. I will correct the record. He's talking about closures, Mr. Speaker. What he's actually referring to are temporary service disruptions. Right. These are service disruptions, Mr. Speaker, that can last as little as 2 or 3 hours due to illness, due to vacation, or due to an unplanned absence of a healthcare worker, Mr. Speaker. If he wants to talk about closures, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, he need only consult with his caucus, because the NDP actually closed 52 hospitals, Mr. Speaker. They actually closed 19 long-term care facilities. Those closures resulted in the permanent closure of facilities in our rural communities. Yeah. Our facilities are continuing to operate, Mr. Speaker. Yes, they have service disruptions. We are addressing those with our Health Human Resources Action Plan, which is the most ambitious plan in the country, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the member from Regina Welsh Acres.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A new rural health care report was just released a couple of weeks ago, and the report raises these unprecedented closures in rural Saskatchewan, leaving thousands of Saskatchewan people without health care when and where they need it. It also raises concerns over the lack of publicly available information on health care closures. Now, the minister would remember that this information used to be posted on the SHA website and was publicly available. But now, under this tired and out-of-touch government, patients have to travel to the hospital to find out that their emergency room is closed. 35% of all healthcare closures were in rural emergency rooms, Mr. Speaker. Again, how many communities are currently experiencing a healthcare closure today?
Recognize the Minister of Rural and Remote Health.
Again, Mr. Speaker, our government doesn't close hospitals. We build hospitals. Mr. Speaker, we may have temporary service disruptions, Mr. Speaker, and we are addressing those with the most ambitious Health Human Resources Action Plan in the nation, Mr. Speaker. That plan is yielding results. The plan was implemented in September of 2022, Mr. Speaker. And since that time, Mr. Speaker, 97 positions have been added to North Battleford, 69 positions to Prince Albert, 47 positions to Moose Jaw, 30 positions to Yorkton, 29 positions to Swift Current, 28 positions to Weyburn, Mr. Speaker. I can go on and on and on for the member opposite. We have rural successes too in Wolseley, Broadview, Kipling, Indian Head, Fort Qu'Appelle, Melville. If the member would like the details, Mr. Speaker, I'm happy to talk more about it.
Recognize the member from Regina Welsh Acres.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, the report doesn't just touch on the hundreds of healthcare closures under this tired and out-of-touch government. It also points to this government's failed Health Human Resource Plan. Fewer healthcare staff in rural Saskatchewan. Fact. Decreasing retention rates. Fact. Chronic vacancy rates. Fact. Decreased access to physicians and specialists. Fact. I could go on and on, Mr. Speaker, across the board. It is clear that this tired and out-of-touch government is taking rural Saskatchewan for granted. Why? Why won't the minister take one of our ideas for a change, like a grow-your-own plan to hire Saskatchewan people?
You're here. Recognize the Minister of Rural and Remote Health.
Mr. Speaker, let's talk about their ideas for rural health, Mr. Speaker. When he was a leader of the opposition, the member for Regina Rosemount demanded that the government implement the expert recommendations of the Fike report on healthcare, Mr. Speaker. This is what the NDP idea for rural healthcare is. The Fike report called on the government to close another 50 hospitals on top of the 52 that they had already closed, Mr. Speaker. That's what the NDP mean when they say take one of our ideas. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the member from Regina Roll-Shakers.
Mr. Speaker, he still doesn't want to talk about his own government's record because it's so bad. Community after community have raised concerns over their struggles to recruit and retain staff. Take this headline from the Mayor of Macun, where they can't keep doctors, and I quote, "Dying for doctors," end quote. Or this one from Raymond Gauthier from the RM of Duck Lake that currently has 8 long-term beds closed due to doctor shortages. Again, quote, "Duck Lake has more empty beds than the whole Northeast combined," end quote. This morning on Evan Bray, we heard from leaders from Wilkie and Biggar. Here's one. Wilkie's ER has been closed since March of 2020. That sounds really temporary, Mr. Speaker. Yeah. What does the minister have to say to the countless communities with Sask Party MLAs that are without the health care people deserve?
Yeah. Recognize the Minister of Rural and Remote Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If the member opposite wants to talk about quotes, let me put another one on the record. Here's a quote, Mr. Speaker. "Now, in the budget, I do see some focus being put on hard-to-recruit training seats. And this is a good thing. Absolutely, yes, we should be training Saskatchewan people for these jobs, and I think specifically of rural people or Indigenous people who are going to stay in their communities once they are trained and where they live there. This is a good strategy," end quote. Who said that, Mr. Speaker? It was the member opposite, the member from Regina Wall-Shakers. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the member from Regina Douglas Park.
Mr. Speaker, this tired and out-of-touch government will use every tool in their toolbox to avoid transparency and accountability. Last week, my colleague and I both asked the Minister of Justice how much public money the Sask Party is spending on private lawyers defending its pronoun policy in the courts. She refused to answer. Mr. Speaker, this is completely unacceptable. Saskatchewan people deserve to know how much of their money, the public's money, not the Sask Party's money, is being spent fighting this court case. Will the minister give us that number today?
Recognize Minister of Justice and Attorney General.
Mr. Speaker, I outlined very clearly last week why retainers are part of solicitor-client privilege, Mr. Speaker. Waiving that, there is a risk that a court could construe it as a full waiver of privilege. Mr. Speaker, all payments to private law firms are posted in public accounts. But I would challenge the members opposite, Mr. Speaker. The member for Regina Elphinstone last week called parental inclusion in a child's life a, quote, questionable priority. CTV News. Those are the true colours, Mr. Speaker, the true beating heart of that opposition, that hard left opposition. She should ask her colleagues, Mr. Speaker, do they agree that parental inclusion is a questionable priority? Regina Coronation Park, Regina Rosemont, would they repeal Bill 3-137, Mr. Speaker? The real motive of the member for Regina Elphinstone is that she wants us to lose that case. She wants parents to lose.
Recognize the member from Regina Douglas Park.
Speaker, we voted against that bill and we look forward to repealing it when we form government. Newsflash, Mr. Speaker, to that minister. Solicitor-client privilege exists to protect the interests of the client. The client is the government of Saskatchewan. Who can waive that privilege? the Sass Party, Mr. Speaker. Now, if she doesn't believe me that that's the case, she can ask the two former justice ministers. They had no problem being open and transparent when it came to the cost of the carbon tax. But now we hear crickets. Interesting how the policy has changed, Mr. Speaker. Again, I ask, how much public money is being used on private lawyers to fight the pronoun case?
You're here. Recognize the Minister of Justice and Attorney General.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The client, Mr. Speaker, is the Ministry of Education. And the case is one in which we are involved in active litigation as the defendant. We did not launch in that, as it was in that case, Mr. Speaker, a reference. Mr. Speaker, let's be very clear. This is a member, the member for John Elphinstone, who went down this road last week, who claims to be the champion of the rule of law, who claims to be a champion of human rights. Yet she has embraced an anti-Semitic phrase, Mr. Speaker, that is deemed so offensive that entire Western democracies, Mr. Speaker, have condemned it. She has been personally censured by B'nai B'rith, Mr. Speaker, yet she told committee that she experienced it differently. Clearly, she feels the same way, Mr. Speaker, about parental rights.
Recognize the member from Regina Douglas Park.
Oh, Mr. Speaker. Now, another newsflash to that minister. There are plenty of examples where governments have had no problem releasing the costs of private lawyers, even when they're acting as the defendant. Even as recently as a few days ago, the federal government, those Trudeau Liberals, Mr. Speaker, had no problem releasing the cost of private lawyers for defending the use of the Emergencies Act. The cost, $2.2 million, Mr. Speaker, but the cost of the pronoun case, well, that minister doesn't want the public to know. Mr. Speaker, how much public money has the Sass Party spent fighting this pronoun case in the courts? You're here.
Recognize the Minister of Justice and Attorney General.
Mr. Speaker, every year, Mr. Speaker, these amounts to private firms are posted on public accounts. It is a common practice. It was the practice under that former government, Mr. Speaker, and that should not be a violated practice when it comes to tactical and strategical considerations during the course of active litigation, Mr. Speaker, which we find ourselves in. We have used private firms in cases where we require additional capacity, where we require additional specialization, Mr. Speaker. $7.7 million with MLT, $800,000 with Toronto-based Benson Percival Brown, $553,000 with Toronto-based Laxton Glass, $258,000 with the world's largest law firm, Dentons, Mr. Speaker. In total, the government spent more than $13.4 million on private law firms available on public accounts at the time. When was that, Mr. Speaker? The last full year of the NDP government.
Recognize the member from Regina Douglas Park.
So this number can be made private or publicly available, as the minister is saying. There's no reason why she can't disclose what amount she is paying that law firm to defend her and her government in the pronoun litigation. It's wild, Mr. Speaker, to see this minister be so unwilling to provide information about public dollars to the public. What did the federal Conservatives have to do to get that Emergencies Act number? Ask the question, Mr. Speaker. Why won't this minister be transparent? Why is she willing to be less transparent than the federal Liberals?
Recognize the Minister of Justice and Attorney General.
Clearly, Mr. Speaker, the member got well-refined arguments from her few intensive days at the Trudeau campaign school on all variety of nuances, Mr. Speaker. The fact of the matter remains, we are in active litigation, Mr. Speaker, not of our making. This is a situation where we must protect privilege. A retainer goes to the heart of privilege, and that is a very important premise, Mr. Speaker, of what the privilege relationship entails. And in this case, Mr. Speaker, we've been very clear that this will be, of course, publicly available, as it always is, every year on public accounts, as it was under them, and that will be the case going forward in this case. Mr. Speaker, clearly the motive here is mischievous, because the motive really is to reveal tactics and strategical consideration along the road, Mr. Speaker, which we will not do.
Recognize a member from Saskatoon Centre.
Mr. Speaker, 113 lives were lost to overdose in the first 3 months of this year. That's more than one person lost to this crisis every single day. We've raised this issue in the Assembly every day this spring sitting. And every day, that minister gives us the same lines about their new policy, the same policy that has resulted in a drastic increase in overdose deaths in neighbouring Alberta. Mr. Speaker, treatment is important. However, you can't check into a treatment centre if you've died of overdose. This crisis is disproportionately impacting Indigenous people. When will this minister provide the evidence-based supports that will keep people alive, like the supports Poundmakers Lodge has been offering for decades?
Recognize the Minister of Mental Health and Addictions.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would just point out Poundmakers Lodge is one of the locations where we have recently acquired spaces to provide addictions treatment, Mr. Speaker, to the people of Saskatchewan. Mr. Speaker, no illicit drugs are safe, and the members opposite want to draw this comparison to other provinces. Well, let's do that, Mr. Speaker. There's a stark contrast to what the NDP governments in Manitoba and British Columbia are doing compared to Saskatchewan, Mr. Speaker. In Manitoba, the NDP just released their budget, and in that budget, Mr. Speaker, they invested $2.5 million to create a drug consumption site, but only $1.5 million to address treatment, Mr. Speaker. That shows you the priorities of the NDP, Mr. Speaker. In Saskatchewan, our priority is on treatment and recovery, Mr. Speaker. Our approach is going to save lives, it's going to heal families, and it's going to strengthen communities, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.